Hey, this is Sam Black, and I'm trying something new today to just to get a feel for what kinds of things people want to hear me talk about. Today, I'm going to talk about the top 10 cards from Neon Dynasty to include in a cube. So, in order to do that, I looked through the whole set and pulled out all the cards that I think are worth considering in the cube. So, the cards that you can see on my screen right now are we could call them the honorable mentions. These are the cards that I considered that did not make my top 10. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these, but I do want to go over all of these cards. I wouldn't be shocked or unhappy to see in a cube, but they didn't end up in my final top 10. Though, looking at this right now, I'm going to say that the reality chip was probably an oversight. That one I think should be in the top 10. But that said, so Lion Sash, I think that this card is very strong. I think that it's ultimately less appealing to me than Scavenging Ooze because I think that the life gain from Scavenging Ooze is really big in addition to the larger body up front. But if you are looking to do anything with artifacts or equipment, power up Stoneforge Mystic, this card does get a lot of extra play. And I think that reconfigure is pretty fun, and including some cards with that ability is an admirable goal. So I would be happy to see Lion Sash in any cube. Spirited Companion is not a super high impact card, but a nice workmanlike Elvish Visionary type card that white really takes a lot of advantage of. There are a lot of Restoration Angel type effects that are happy if you have this kind of, differently statted Wall of Omens type card. I think this is somewhat of a cube staple kind of effect, and if you're doing anything with enchantments whatsoever, then this becomes really appealing to anyone who's drafting around that kind of thing. Restoration of a Ganjo. I'm a really big fan of sagas, and this is in a really fun space where it's kind of an implicit 2-for-1, where you get both the 3/4 vigilance body, and then you also essentially get a ramp spell where you put a planes into play, except it's cooler than that because if you want, you can use it as this reanimation for cheap permanence effect instead, which means that it has what ultimately usually plays out as dual purpose in the early game and late game, where early it's just kind of giving you an extra land, and then you might discard a land and immediately put that land into play. But in the late game, you get this toolbox of everything in your graveyard that you get to get back. And in powerful formats like cubes, there are a lot of high impact, cheap permanents that you can get back. So I think this card is really fun in any sort of like mid-range white deck. This is another card I'd be really happy to see in a cube that I'm playing with. I think this set overall is great for cubes, which is why there are so many cards in addition to top 10 that aren't on this screen right now. The reality chip gives you this budget future sight, and future sight's a super fun card to play with, and the budget makes it reasonable to cast in a cube and not worry about your 5-mana spell getting countered and you getting totally blown out on tempo there, as well as giving it some Stoneforge synergies if that's what you're looking for. Being able to play as an early blocker is nice. This is just a pretty strong, pretty fun card. Tamashii Reality Architect is a little more narrow. It's very slow and requires a lot of artifacts and enchantments in your deck. Really, really, really strong in Neon Dynasty, but it's not going to be as strong in most cubes, which is why it's only on the honorable mention list. I think it's really going to come down to the density of artifacts and enchantments that are in your cube and how much you are trying to do with that in blue and white. And I also think that it depends on how you treat these cards that have off-color activated abilities in terms of whether you feel like they disrupt the color balance if you just treat them as blue cards, and whether you want, if you're treating this as kind of like a blue, white, gold card, whether that's like fair to white, and also then it's up against some like potentially stiff competition for a pretty narrow slot in your cube. So this is a little more fringe. Then Jinji Taxis. This is just, you know, it's mostly going to function as a high impact reanimation target. Um, I don't know where it ultimately ranks among reanimation targets. I don't think that long term this is going to prove to be among the best. I think this is kind of a replacement level expensive card, but if you like to just kind of change up which expensive cards you have in your deck, I think it's fine, or in your cube, I think it's fine to just kind of rotate this in, let people play with it for a little while, and then maybe take it out later. I think it's about as powerful as something like Sheldred, maybe a little bit better because of protecting itself. Um, Dockside Chef. Uh, this is a nice little utility creature. It's a little too expensive to use for me to be really excited about it, even as someone who likes this kind of effect a lot. So it doesn't quite make it for me. But if you are in, if what you're doing with black is a lot of this, like making tokens and sacrifice them and stuff, and you have a lot of cards like uh, all the blood artist type cards. If all that stuff is in your cube, this might be a good addition. The Cube of Reckner Raid is a good rate black aggressive card. I mostly think that cubes should not try to support like dedicated black aggro decks. I think in the very early days of cubes, it was really popular to include just like random pretty bad 2/2s for one in black. Um, I think that this card is in that space. It's among the better black aggressive one drops, but I would not like to see this card in a cube. I think that that's not what you should be trying to do with black. Um, Junji, the Midnight Sky, is the one dragon I've included from this cycle. I don't like this cycle of dragon that much. I think that it's just there are too many like bounce and exile effects. You don't get enough value up front for this cycle of dragon. I think if you are going to play one of them, this is probably the best of them. But I would not be inclined to include this cycle of dragon. I think there are just too many better mid-range threats. Invoke Despair. This is, I guess, the token inclusion from the Invoke cycle. I'm a big fan personally of the kind of like mono black mid range control archetype, and this is a card that's fun for me to cast. I think it's a little too narrow. Um, I don't think it's actually really all that great as 5 mana sorceries go, but it's just a pretty fun grindy card for me, so it warrants consideration. Red, Kumano Faces Kakazon is a good amount of like damage and power and toughness for a single red. It's a reasonable red one drop. Um, I think that it might be. I think it's on par with probably a lot of red one drops that are in whatever cube you have. But I'm not. I kind of prefer erring toward uh, only playing like the real staples among the red one drops, that have like proven themselves in constructed, and then trying to support other red strategies aside from just the typical like mono red aggro. So this isn't really adding a lot in terms of making red more interesting in the cube for me, so it falls a little bit short. Um, Tamiya's Safekeeping is a card that I think is a pretty unique effect and very powerful. I think it's just a really good rate, good versatility. But I also don't think anyone would actually draft this or put it in their deck in most cubes. And so while it might be right or might be an interesting sideboard card or might be, good enough, I just think that it's not appealing enough to get players excited. And I think most people drafting would just wonder what it's doing in a pack. So it's in kind of an interesting space there, but that's where I expect it would end up. Jugen defends the temple. This is here again mostly just because I really like these value sagas. I think it's ends up being a tiny bit low impact. I think that the Flyer is a little slow for cube environments, and the man, I think all around this card it just ends up being a touch too slow for cube, which is why it didn't quite make it for me, but does warrant consideration. It's in a kind of similar space to the Restoration of Iganjo, but I think just not quite as good. Springleaf Avenger. I'm a big fan of ninjutsu in cube where you can get it, especially in green that doesn't have a lot of options for it. This is ends up in that just kind of like generically too expensive mid-range space, pretty similar to the dragons. I like that it can get you more immediate value, both off the thing that you return and the big hit while your opponent's potentially tapped out that can get a card back from your graveyard. So it's pretty like I think it's a pretty fun random mid-range threat. I just don't know if this is going to be better than something like a Wolfir Silverheart or some kind of other just 4 or 5 mana green threat that someone could play. And so I just think there's really high competition for 5 mana green creatures, and I don't know if this makes it, but I do think that it's a little bit more fun, interesting play pattern. Certainly, if you have played with Fallen Shinobi, have that in your cube and like the way that plays, this is a way to get another ninja in that space that's a little bit less oppressive, maybe a little more fun. The Kami War, this is among the most generically strong and appealing 5-color cards in Magic. So if you like having a random card for people to try to pull off a 5-color mana base, I think this is a great card to throw a bone to that deck. Probably if you could include only a single card that costs all 5 colors of mana, I think I would go for this one. That said, I don't know if you want to bother offering a card like that. It really depends on whether this is something that you want to encourage players to go for. So this is really going to vary from cube to cube. Colossal Sky Turtle, I really appreciate the versatility on this card. It has 3 different modes, and all of them are just a touch below rate, but offer interesting considerations in game, dynamic play. The fact that it has 2 different instant speed abilities mean that you can just kind of hold it up and use it as you see fit in each game. I think that it does a good job as a modal card of having all 3 modes come up with somewhat comparable frequency, which is always a win as far as modal designs go. And if you have anything that lets you do like fun loops with this card, that would be another argument for it, though that's not particularly unique in cubes. You could do similar things with regrowth or whatever other cards you have that offer that effect. This is, another one where it's, I think, good for cubes that are on the slightly low power level and that are more looking for like fun, versatile cards rather than the like absolute top tier competitive cards. So another one that's going to vary from cube to cube. Next up, the full cycle of legendary lands. I think all of these are really interesting in a cube draft in terms of just like they're going to be better than a basic most of the time, but is that worth a pick is always an interesting question to be asked when you're drafting a deck that, if you're like mono red and you could have, just like a good aggressive creature, or you could take this land and the land would go in your deck for sure and make it a little bit better, but is it as much better as the like creature? Just valuing the value over replacement of a land instead of a non-land offers a decision with different context. That said, personally, I find lands that don't offer multiple colors of mana to have a really, really high barrier of entry in cube, just because I think that cubes are pretty fun when you can have good mana, and given that there are a finite number of lands in a cube, these monocolor lands are essentially competing with dual lands for space. I might prefer to have a dual land in the pack. So I think that this cycle plays best if you include, most of it or line it up with other monocolored lands. And you really want to think about like what you want lands to be doing in your cube, how many colors you want people to be playing, and stuff like that when you're determining whether or not you want to include these. So that's the full honorable mention list. Now the top 10, starting with number 10, we have Kappa Tech Wrecker. So I mentioned that I really like ninjas, but that Springleaf Avenger is a little too expensive. I like that Kappa Tech Wrecker has a much cheaper ninjutsu cost to let you pick up creatures with enter the battlefield abilities. I think that this is a very reasonable creature to just cast up front as a 1/3 Death Touch. 1/3 Death Touch by itself plays reasonably well in limited, but isn't quite strong enough for cube. But with the ninjutsu, this gets a lot of utility, and then it's always nice to have disenchant effects in cubes. There are a lot of like mana rocks and stuff like that that are going to be valuable to blow up. Ninjutsu helps you accomplish that, but you can also do it just by playing this and attacking with it. So I think that this is going to have pretty fun dynamic play. Appeal to some decks that are just looking to play green creatures, and also appeal to people who are looking to get some synergies with ninjutsu. Next up, Biting Palm Ninja. Similar situation here. A lot of the reason for this is just that ninjutsu is so good, and then also, of course, this coercion effect is absolutely huge. It exiles rather than discards, which is rare and valuable in cube. 3/3 Menace is pretty easy to connect, so you don't have to play cheaper creatures to make this work, but you get extra value if you do play cheap creatures. It offers a lot of, once you have this card and you're trying to use it, it changes how you value other cards. It tells you to find cheap creatures to play, especially cheap creatures that have like enters battlefield abilities or evasion or something. So I think this is pretty fun black mid-range card with some relatively dynamic play. So I think it's a pretty good inclusion. Up next, we have Kaito Shizuki. This is, I do think that I penalize any kind of gold card because I know that gold slots are highly contested. You don't want too many multicolor cards in your cube, but I do think that this is a pretty fun planeswalker. I think that power level wise, it's potentially comparable to either 3-mana Ashiok, but with somewhat of a less oppressive play pattern. I think that Ashiok's mill effects can feel like disproportionately strong in 40 card formats, and it can just like be frustrating to play against those, while Kaito plays like a little bit more of a normal planeswalker. But I think that the phasing dynamic is pretty unique and fun, and I like that this encourages aggressive blue and black decks, which I think are really fun. I like playing like blue black creature strategies, little like potentially tempo oriented fairy type space or whatever. And so I like that a lot of its power is tied up in, oh, this is better if you put cheap creatures in your deck. So similar incentives to like the Biting Palm Ninja, but also a totally functional planeswalker in a control deck because you can just make that 1/1 ninja and then use that to start enabling the card draw option with it. So I think there's some good play with this. I think it's at the right power level and has fun play patterns. So it's a planeswalker I like a good amount. Next up, Rabbit Battery. This is very much just like a red aggro card, and it might not even be among the strongest red aggro cards, but I think it's among the more fun red aggro cards. I mentioned that I like reconfigure, and I'd want some of that in the cube, and I think that you can kind of like find interesting creatures to give haste to and just get some of that equipment play in the mid game where you kind of move around your +1/+1s and stuff. So this is a card that I'm a little bit more inclined to play. I mentioned that I, want only the like real premium red aggressive cards. but this one earns a lot of points for me just for having a unique play pattern among red aggressive cards. Next up, Reckner Bankbuster. We're really reaching critical mass on cards like Treasure Map and Maze Mine Tome, and this is kind of the third installment of the high power level 2-mana artifacts that have some counters and ultimately draw you around 3 cards or whatever. I think that those cards are good, fun, the right power level for cube, appealing to a wide variety of decks, and I felt like they have pretty good, like, some cubes and some decks really want them, and it's always interesting to me to like try to puzzle out whether I have a deck that's looking for that kind of effect or not. So I do think that this card is really in the right spot for cube, but it does have competition where at some point there are diminishing returns to how many of this kind of card you put in your cube as we see more cards in this space, but it's a space that I like a lot. So I'm happy to go a little bit deeper on that for now, maybe potentially trim down some of those cards eventually. Next up, March of Otherworldly Light. I think this is a really strong card. Obviously cubes and older formats lend themselves to people trying to play cheap cards. When you're filling your decks with cheap cards, the X in this gets a lot less painful, and just the fact that this can hit artifacts, creatures, and enchantments gives it just a lot of versatility. So I think that while this card is nowhere near as efficient as something like Path to Exile, I think that it's really comparably appealing, since it doesn't give your opponent a land and it gets the extra versatility. I think that the addition of this and Prismatic Ending might be the name. I'm bad with the name of that one because I've played with it with a playtest name and its actual name. But the Modern Horizons 2 card that costs this much mana and is a sorcery that exiles something. I like both of these cards. I think both of them are appealing removal spells in white, and I would want both of them in most cubes that I were building or playing with. Next up, Farewell. This is one of many sweepers that is more expensive than Wrath of God. This is in kind of the austere command space where it can answer a lot of things, but you can also try to line it up so that it answers your opponent's things and not your things. But I think that the modes here are really, really strong, really versatile, giving white this answer to artifacts or enchantments, and including graveyards here is really, really big. It's always tricky in cubes to figure out how to value graveyard hate because there are so many strong things you can do in cube with graveyards, but you also really don't want to play like dedicated graveyard hate. So getting this strong graveyard hate effect on a card that has play for other reasons, and then getting like a sweeper that is not really oppressive against aggressive decks, but has play against people who aren't just playing creatures. I like a lot of what this card offers. Next up, Shigeki, Jukai Visionary. I think this card's just super, super fun. I love the incremental value offered by playing it and using its ability, milling cards to enable graveyard stuff, and then the channel is just a really good big effect late. It's one of the only cards in the game that can regrow multiple cards without exiling itself. So this card lets you do a bunch of like really fun, interesting graveyard loops. And there are likely a lot of cards in most cubes already that naturally work with that. Any of your Eternal Witness type cards or whatever, anything at all that can get a card out of your graveyard and into your hand can combine with this to give you the ability to eventually rebuy all of the non-legendary cards in your graveyard. And I just find that to be a really fun dream for any kind of green deck to have powerful late game. So And then I like that it's a card that's strong and threatening early, but doesn't end the game. Gives your cube games a little bit more of a commander feel, where the early game is spent just kind of like ramping, and the late game is playing big effects. And it's not so much, oh, if I played a card that's good to play early in the game, it means I'm going to kill you. Shigeki's a card that's good to play early, but says, let's hang out, let's play a fun game of Magic, let's play a lot of cards and exchange resources, all that. So I'm a fan in casual Magic of like the kind of play patterns that Shigeki encourages. And second to last, my number 2 card, the Wandering Emperor. I think this is one of the strongest planeswalkers ever printed. I have it, around 10th best. And so, if you like to have the strongest planeswalkers in your cube, I think you probably have at least 10 planeswalkers in a cube that's using planeswalkers. So if you're just looking for the strong ones, this would make the list to me on power level. But I also think that with Flash, it has just a really different play pattern than other planeswalkers. And I think that I really like the way that Flash plays with all of its abilities, where each of them is better uh, at instant speed in a way that really front loads the value of this planeswalker, which makes it less frustrating to play against as the game goes on, because the value that it's giving you while it sticks on the battlefield is smaller than its upfront value. So if it takes you a while as the person playing against the Wandering Emperor to answer it, it's not like, if it sticks in play for a couple turns, you feel like the game has become absolutely insurmountable. Um, so I think that it's a strong planeswalker with unique play pattern that's relatively not frustrating to play against. Just a kind of clean 2-for-1 that leaves you with this card that your opponent wants to deal with, but isn't that hard to deal with. So I really like everything Wandering Emperor is doing for gameplay. And my final number 1 card for Cube, Fable of the Mirror Breaker. I mentioned that I really like sagas. This is a great one. Getting a creature that the two goblin that makes a treasure is just a very real threat, because making a treasure is awesome, especially in limited format where your opponent doesn't know if that treasure is going to let you cast some weird expensive card or some card that you don't have the colors of mana to play until you get the treasure. Um, and then the looting just makes sure that you get to do more stuff in the game, but also gives it synergy if you're trying to do any kind of graveyard stuff, reanimator or whatever. And then Kiki-Jiki is just a really fun card to play with, but it's usually so prohibitive to cast that it really feels like you need to be using it in like a combo capacity. But because this card is just like a 3-drop that doesn't give you Kiki-Jiki right away and has all this like built-in value, it ends up in more of a mid-range role. And so you're kind of just like mid-range value decks get to play with Kiki-Jiki, which is a super fun card to untap with, um, that they normally wouldn't uh, get to have. And then some portion of the time, you get to do all the fun Kiki shenanigans with whatever sweet creatures you have in your cube, um, but in a way that's like less combo centric. And that to me just means that you get to do more fun stuff with it and less game ending stuff with it. And so that's just good all around. I think that this is really a not necessarily more powerful, but more fun Kiki-Jiki than the original, which makes it a big win in my book for a cube. Giving red, I mentioned that I want red to do more than just the narrow-minded mono red aggro space. This is a really fun red card that gives it some dynamic play, good mid-range power. So huge fan of Reflections of Kiki-Jiki. And those are my thoughts on Neon Dynasty for Cube. I'm really interested to know if this is the kind of content people are looking for. I could see a series of even going back through older sets and talking about highlights from those that you might have missed for your cube. Also, if anyone is listening to this and getting inspired about cards for commander decks, because there are really similar goals in Commander and Cube, be sure to let me know, and I can try to think about maybe making some more explicit mention of that kind of space while I'm doing this. So, hope you enjoyed it. If you stuck around to hear, I assume you did, and uh, I'm excited to see if this is a sort of content that I should embrace and do more of for people. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you later in another video.